April 15, 1912, the Titanic vanishes into the North Atlantic, and with it, three of America's most powerful men disappear in a single night. At first glance, it looks like a tragedy of ice, arrogance, and bad luck. But the paper trail that followed points to something far stranger. Because while Titanic sank, another battle was moving quietly on land. In Washington, power was shifting in ways most people never saw coming. Not in years, not over decades. In just 20 months, 3 constitutional changes would pass that had resisted America for generations. The names aboard Titanic mattered. Jacob Astor IV, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim were not just wealthy men, they were political forces. Astor alone controlled a fortune worth millions in 1912 money. Straus helped build Macy's and had served in Congress. Guggenheim represented industrial power at its peak. These were not men who simply attended elite dinners. They sat at the intersection of money, policy, and the kind of influence that reshapes governments, and that is why their deaths mattered beyond the ship itself. When powerful opposition disappears, the balance around it begins to move. At the same time, the Peugeot Committee was digging into Wall Street's concentration of power. Morgan-linked institutions were under real pressure. Demands were growing louder. Demands for oversight, for accountability, and for breaking the quiet machinery that had ruled finance for decades. Then, in the middle of that pressure, the Titanic's most controversial passengers were gone, and with them a set of political objections vanished overnight. That coincidence is where the story turns darker, because the timeline after the disaster moves with almost unnatural speed. Within months, 3 changes that had failed for generations suddenly found a path through Congress and into American life. The 16th Amendment opened the door to a federal income tax. The 17th shifted Senate elections away from state legislatures and toward direct popular vote. Then came the Federal Reserve Act, signed in December 1913. That single law changed how money would be controlled in the United States, and all of it happened after years of resistance. These were reforms that had stalled, failed, and been buried before the Titanic ever sailed. So the question is not whether the change was real. The question is why the door opened so suddenly and for whom. Meanwhile, another strange detail was already on the record. J.P. Morgan had booked passage on Titanic, then cancelled at the last moment. Officially, he said he was ill. The cancellation was dated April 10, 1912. 5 days later, Titanic was at the bottom of the sea. Then there is the photograph from Aix-les-Bains, taken soon after, showing Morgan looking far better than a man supposedly too sick to travel. Even stranger, parts of his art collection were removed before the voyage. The records exist. The contradiction remains. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Separate documents keep pointing toward the same narrow corridor of time. At this point, the official explanation still leans on ice, navigation errors, and bad decisions. But that explanation does not answer the political timing. Why did 3 long-blocked reforms suddenly pass after the sinking? Why did the men who might have resisted them never return? The archives are still there, manifests, telegrams, amendments, and testimony. Read in the right order. They suggest that Titanic may have carried more than passengers. The story moves east, into the financial districts where power was not announced in speeches, but in closed rooms and private letters. That is where the next layer begins. Before the Titanic ever sailed, the money question in America was already a battlefield. Wall Street banks, agrarian politicians, and reformers all knew the system itself was being contested. That conflict had a legal target, the old pattern of state influence over senators and the still unfinished fight over how money would be created. Both issues threatened concentrated wealth. In Washington, reformers had spent decades pushing for a constitutional change that would let federal taxes reach ordinary income. Each attempt had failed, delayed, or been buried by resistance. The same pattern surrounded the Senate. For generations, direct election of senators had been framed as dangerous, unnecessary, even radical by the men who benefited from the older system. Then came the central banking question. The panic of 1907 had exposed how fragile American finance really was, and the response was never purely technical. It was political. That fear helped justify new institutions, but it also sharpened opposition. Many Americans believed one private banking network would control credit, debt, and the nation's future from behind a curtain. That is why the Titanic matters here. The men aboard were not random passengers. They represented the very circles most determined to resist further centralization of financial power. Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim were not simply wealthy men enjoying a voyage. They stood inside a web of business, municipal, and congressional influence that had real consequences. The ship's manifest placed them in one place, but the political map placed them somewhere else, inside the resistance to the coming order. That makes their absence historically loud. Then the details around J.P. Morgan's trip start to look unsettling. His cancellation, the strange public appearance days later, and the gap in between raise a question that never quite goes away. And there's more. His art collection was handled with unusual urgency, with valuable pieces removed before departure, as if someone already knew the voyage would not happen as planned. Meanwhile, the ship was receiving warnings from the ice field. Officers logged them, radio operators repeated them, and still the Titanic kept her pace into the night. What made them ignore so many warnings? This is where the official explanation grows thin. The colder the water became, the more it seems decisions were made not by caution, but by confidence in the route ahead. After the sinking, the political calendar began to move with almost unnatural speed. Long-stalled reforms suddenly found the votes, the signatures, and the momentum they had lacked for years. The speed mattered because these were not new ideas. They were old fights, repeatedly defeated by organized opposition, suddenly moving as if the opposition had been cleared away. The banking reform fight is especially revealing. For years, Americans had argued over whether the nation needed a central institution or should keep money closer to local control. But after the Titanic, the reformers won at a pace that looked less like persuasion and more like opportunity. The old defensive line had been broken at exactly the right moment. That does not prove a conspiracy by itself, but it does explain why later generations kept returning to the same discomfort. The timing made the official story feel incomplete. What makes the episode darker is how neatly the public record fragments the evidence. Each archive appears innocent alone, only the sequence turns it into a political disaster. And that is why the Titanic keeps returning to this story. It may not have been the cause of the reforms, but it appears to have removed the people best able to stop them. The men who died were not abstract symbols. They were active centers of influence whose absence changed who could fund resistance, organize allies, and slow the coming shift. Once that kind of power is gone, history rarely announces the vacancy. It simply moves into it, and later generations inherit the new structure as if it had always been inevitable. So the question is not whether the archives exist. They do. The real question is why such a decisive convergence of deaths, reforms, and money was ever allowed to look accidental. Because if the Titanic carried more than passengers, then the most important cargo may have been the future of American power itself. And that future was rewritten in the dark. To understand the trap, you have to look beyond the wreckage. In Washington, powerful men were already preparing a financial order that would outlive the passengers below. The fight was never just over money. It was over who would control credit, debt, and the nation's future obligations. After the panic of 1907 exposed how fragile the system really was. That panic had forced emergency rescues, and rescue meant precedent. The banking elite learned something dangerous. In a crisis, public fear could be turned into permanent reform. So by 1912, the real battle had a name: the money trust. Newspapers, hearings, and senators were beginning to say out loud what bankers preferred to keep invisible. At the center of it stood Senator Nelson Aldrich, the broker of the old order. He wasn't just another politician. He was a bridge between Wall Street and the state itself. Across the ocean, another network was tightening. The Bank of England, European finance houses, and private American interests were all tied together by the same language of credit. This matters because Titanic sailed inside that same world, a floating palace built from the wealth, contracts, and confidence of the very class now under investigation. And on that ship, the first-class passenger list read like a roll call of industrial power. These men were not ornaments. They were active participants in the political economy of the age. Aldrich's allies had already tested the waters years earlier at Jekyll Island, where the blueprint for a central bank was quietly drafted under cover of secrecy. but secrecy breeds suspicion, and suspicion breeds resistance. By 1912, reformers had turned the central bank question into a public referendum on democracy versus private control. That is where the missing names become important. If a reform movement is facing its strongest opponents on one ship, the loss is not just personal, it is strategic. Morgan's withdrawal from the voyage still deepens the mystery. The official explanation was illness, but the timing placed him outside the disaster and inside the transformation. Even more suspicious was the cancellation of valuable cargo and artworks tied to his travel plans. Wealth had to be moved, but it did not all move together. On deck, the warnings multiplied. Wireless operators were flooded with iceberg reports, yet the ship pressed forward as if the sea itself had been told to wait. Why continue at speed through a known danger zone? Because decisions at the top often reflect priorities hidden from the deck below. The sinking itself became a machine for rewriting power. By the time rescue lights reached the sea, the men who most threatened the new banking order were already gone. Then came the hearings, and hearings are where truth is supposed to surface. But the official inquiries focused on ice, hull design and procedure more than political consequences. That narrowing of the story mattered. Once the disaster was reduced to navigation error, the larger effect, the political vacuum it created, could slip past the public eye. Meanwhile, reformers lost the men who could fund resistance, lobby legislators, and challenge the emerging consensus. A death at sea can silence more than a voice. It can erase a coalition. That absence echoed quickly in the capital. Lobbyists, trustmen, and sympathetic senators suddenly found the chamber less crowded, the opposition less organized, and the path forward much clearer. The result was not one bill, but a sequence of victories. First, the tax structure changed, then Senate elections were altered, and finally the Federal Reserve became law. Each change had its own history, but together they formed a corridor of power. The old resistance had been weakened, and the new architecture of finance could move through. That's why the timing refuses to feel harmless. When a disaster removes the loudest opponents and the laws they opposed follow in rapid sequence, coincidence starts to look organized. And yet the archives stay maddeningly ordinary. No smoking gun, no confession, just ledgers, hearings, cables, and the silence left behind by powerful absences. So the question is not whether Titanic sank. It is whether its sinking cleared the path for a banking coup powerful enough to reshape America in private. That silence after Titanic did not stay silent for long. In Washington, the money questions suddenly moved from theory into law, as if someone had cleared the room. The first target was not the ship itself, but the old resistance to federal power. For decades, elite bankers and local power brokers had blocked any serious central control. That resistance had a name in the press, but its real machinery sat behind closed doors. The Pujo hearings were already exposing how a few firms controlled credit, railroads, and industry. The hearings mattered because they gave the public a language for suspicion. Once ordinary Americans saw the structure, they could no longer pretend the system was neutral. And yet the answers never came from the hearing rooms. They came from the calendar, where the pace of reform became almost unnaturally efficient. In February 1913, the 16th Amendment advanced federal income taxation. For decades that idea had failed, stalled, and been mocked as politically impossible. What changed was not the argument, but the atmosphere around it. After Titanic, old objections no longer carried the same force in the chambers of power. The 17th Amendment followed in April, stripping state legislatures of direct Senate control. That reform had been debated for generations, yet suddenly it slid through history's gears. Then came December, and the Federal Reserve Act passed under the cover of the holiday rush. Critics had killed central banking before, but this time the door stayed open. Why did the last lock on financial power fall so quickly? Because the political terrain had changed, and the old coalition no longer had its full defenders. The absence of Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim mattered because money is not just money in Washington, it is patronage, pressure, access, and the quiet removal of obstacles. Astor's estate, Straus's political bridge, and Guggenheim's industrial reach did not vanish cleanly. Their absence created delays, disputes, and a sudden thinning of opposition. Even the language of reform had changed by then. It was no longer about whether centralized money would exist, but who would define its rules. That question belonged to men who understood timing better than speeches. In power politics, a missing voice can be worth more than 1,000 arguments. One clue lies in the way the Titanic story was framed immediately afterward. The public was taught to see catastrophe, not consequence, and that framing mattered. That is why the official explanation feels too small. Ice can sink a ship, but it cannot explain why so many political doors opened right afterward. The timing becomes stranger when you study reform archives side by side. Legal breakthroughs appear almost synchronized with the disappearance of the men most likely to resist them. Reform did not need a conspiracy to move. It only needed weakened opposition and a public distracted by grief. That is how power usually travels, quietly and legally. And yet, even now, historians argue over intention because intention is the hardest thing to prove. Documents show sequence, but sequence is only the beginning of suspicion. That is why the central mystery survives. Not because the records are hidden, but because the records are scattered across institutions that rarely speak to each other. Seen together, the pattern is hard to ignore. A sinking at sea, a collapse of old opposition, and a once impossible set of reforms all converge inside the same narrow window. At that point, the story stops being about one ship and becomes about a system learning to survive itself. The wreck is visible, but the rearrangement is the real event. So the deeper scandal is not only who died on Titanic, it is how quickly the balance of American power changed once those deaths had removed specific obstacles. If that chain of events was accidental, it remains one of history's strangest coincidences. If it was not, then Titanic was not just a tragedy, but an opening move, and the final question is waiting in the records themselves. Somewhere between the ship's last night and the new financial order that followed, there is still one missing instruction. The trail does not begin with the iceberg. It begins with a missing night, a cancelled berth, and a financial order that changed forever after the ship sank. On paper, the Titanic was an accident, but the men who died aboard it belonged to the class that could still resist Wall Street's design. Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim were not ordinary passengers. Each carried wealth, influence, and enough political weight to disturb the financial coalition gathering power in New York. Astor's fortune could sway an era. Straus had roots in Congress. Guggenheim stood inside the industrial machine itself. Their deaths did more than create grief. It stripped opponents from the board at the exact moment banking reform was under pressure. One disappearance can be tragic. 3 can reshape the room. And then there was Morgan. The records show a berth reserved, then withdrawn, a cancelled crossing, a sudden illness, and a timeline that refuses to settle. 10 days after the cancellation, Morgan appears alive, mobile, and well enough to be photographed abroad. The official excuse remains, but the visual evidence feels staged by absence. His art collection was also moved before the voyage. That detail matters because wealthy men do not rearrange priceless possessions unless they expect the journey to change. On the same stage, the Titanic's captain received warning after warning from the sea. Ice reports came in, yet the great liner held its course as if protected by certainty. That decision still hangs there. Too many warnings, too little reaction. Whether error or instruction, the outcome was the same. The ship entered the dark unchanged. Then the calendar starts to move with unbearable precision. Within months, reforms that are stored for generations begin clearing every obstacle in sight. First came the income tax amendment, then direct election of senators, then the Federal Reserve Act. 3 barriers fell before the public had time to understand the pattern. That speed matters. These were not new ideas. Taxation had failed before. Direct senatorial elections had been debated for decades, and central banking had already collapsed more than once. So why did the resistance vanish now? Because when rivals die, their allies scatter. Influence is not only money, it is continuity, and continuity was cut. A grieving household fights different battles than a political bloc. Estates go to court, networks go quiet. By the time anyone regrouped, the votes were already moving, and the vote count did not pause for mourning. In Washington, process moves faster than memory, especially when the opposition no longer sits at the table. Look at the architecture too. The Titanic belonged to a world of hand-carved grandeur, while the coming decade favored speed, scale, and less human labor. That shift was not just aesthetic. A stoneworker who once needed a team could soon be replaced by machines, templates, and a much cheaper idea of progress. Now ask what the silence bought. It bought a Federal Reserve that could steer credit, a Congress more directly answerable to voters, and a tax system reaching deeper. That is why the timing feels too neat. The ship fell, the critics vanished, and the legal machinery kept moving as if someone had removed the last obstacle on purpose. But the strongest evidence is not a headline. It is the archive itself, manifests, telegrams, hearings, amendments, and testimony, all surviving in separate drawers. Taken alone, each file can be explained away. Together they form a corridor of timing so narrow it almost feels engineered for a single outcome. So what was the missing instruction? Not a signed order, perhaps. Sometimes history's commands are quieter. Move this man, delay that crossing, let the rest unfold. If this chain was accidental, it is one of the strangest coincidences ever preserved in federal records. If it was planned, then Titanic was only the opening move, and the real machinery was still waiting in the shadows. That is where the trail stops being about one ship and starts becoming about a system that could organize people as easily as it organized money. And once a country learns to number its citizens, you have to wonder who was counting whom and for what purpose.